The causes of the French Revolution are many, and so similar to the Enlightenment lecture, I would urge you to keep up with the reading as you're going through this lecture so that you can understand all the detail and complexity of this event. I'm going to attempt in this lecture to take you through as clearly and concisely as I can the many changes, the many governments that occur, but paying close attention to that reading will enable you to move forward consistently through this complex but seminal period in Western civilization. So, what are some of the causes of the French Revolution? Well, one of the issues is debt, and this is a reoccurring theme in French history and is a problem that the King of France, Louis XVI, has to face head-on. Now, one of the problems is not only is France struggling from the debts of the accumulated wars of Louis XIV, the 7 Years' War, the War of Austrian Succession, all of those. Additionally, Louis XVI got involved in a new war. Louis, in an attempt to get revenge against the British, had gotten involved in the American Revolution, first by funding them covertly and then sending troops. And this causes even greater economic strains on the French state. It's made worse that in the immediate years preceding the French Revolution, you have a series of bad harvests, meaning that the French society is starting to strain. Food prices are rising, and people are concerned about famine. And lastly, people in this time of crisis are starting to question whether or not France is set up properly, those influence, if you will, of enlightened ideals. So how do we get a revolution? Well, recognizing that the French state is up the proverbial creek, if you will, Louis XVI takes bold action. He decides to call the Estates General. This is an assemblage of the, if you will, the people of France, but it is as a sign in terms of how little it had mattered in absolutist France. It had not been called since 1614. And as the Estates General is called, it showcased not the cooperation of France, but indeed some of the problems of France and the divisions within society. How so? Well, let me bring that out. The Estates General was made up of 3 estates. The first estate was the clergy, made up of 2 to 3% of the population. The second estate were the nobility of France, making up 2 to 4% of the population. Now, the third estate is often presented as representing everybody else, but not really. It's mostly the wealthy, middle class, the professionals, lawyers, who spoke for, if you will, everybody else, but just put it mildly, there were no peasants attending the Estates General. Now, when the Estates General meets, rather than fixing problems, instead it just showcases more of the divisions of the French state. They start fighting about how to vote, namely the first and second estate want to have their rights preserved and have more voting power than the mass of the third estate, and eventually the frustration boils over to the point that the third estate decides to leave the Estates General, travel to the tennis court at Versailles, and declare an oath that they will create a new constitution for France. They declare their assembly the National Assembly, saying that they speak for the nation of France, and they are going to create a new constitution. And they've resolved that they are not going to leave until they do so. And they might say, oh, well and good to make an oath. I can make an oath that I'm going to play for an NFL team, but I can promise you that won't make a dime's worth of difference to an NFL team. So what's the oath matter? Why doesn't Louis XVI just send in troops and crush this rebellion, this revolution in its cradle? Well, for the reason that it survives, we need to turn to another important event in French history. Paris at this time is a hotbed of discontent. The French urban poor are dealing with high unemployment, concern about food prices, and they hear rumors that Louis XVI is considering moving troops against the Third Estate, against the National Assembly. In response to this, the people rise up and storm what is known as the Bastille. It is a royal fortress and prison in Paris, and they storm it. In the minds of the people of Paris, what they are attacking is not simply a fortress, not simply a prison. It is a symbol of royal authority, a symbol of despotism. And indeed, in many ways, the storming of the Bastille represents both the idealism of the French Revolution as well as its darker, violent edge. Because during the assault on the Bastille, the people are fired upon by the guards, and so when they take the Bastille, they escort the warden of the Bastille to City Hall and behead him, carrying his head around on a pike, suggesting in many ways the violence that is to come to consume the French Revolution. Now, the Bastille, the fall of the Bastille, though, is most well remembered as being a symbol of the people rising up to claim their rights. It's not for nothing that the Bastille Day is celebrated until France today. It's celebrated as a symbol of the people rising up, pushing back against the symbol of tyranny and the symbol of royal authority. There's a famous illustration of the time period in which the Bastille is in the background, and the artist has chosen to represent the three estates as three people. And as one noble and one clergyman look in shocked and feigned horror, they see the third estate representing the people throwing off shackles, lying on the ground, throwing off shackles and picking up a gun. And so the symbol of the Bastille, the storming of this symbol of royal privilege and prerogative, extends not only simply to France today, but also France throughout its history. And indeed, it served as a symbol for France at that time, because after the fall of the Bastille, across France, peasants decided to try and rise up and attack, if you will, their Bastilles, their symbols of royal or noble privilege. Across France, peasants rose up and attacked royal outposts and the like. And this is important because this fall of the Bastille and the Great Fear proves to Louis XVI that he cannot stop the National Assembly. He can't move against it. The people will rise up against him. And so because of those actions, symbolic or otherwise, the National Assembly gets to continue its work. And what are some of the actions it gets up to? Well, it tries to reform the government of France along enlightened lines. It gets rid of old noble divisions crisscrossing France and creates the department system, which carries over into modern France today. They ban strikes and guilds in an attempt to modernize the economy and keep the economy going. And then they take two actions that they think will help with some of the systemic problems of France, but actually cause more problems than they'd like. In an attempt to get the debt under control, they decide to issue, noted here, assignats, paper currency that the government is issuing, backed by the future sales of church land. The hope is this will keep the economy functioning. They'll be able to pay down the debt. The problem is the people are so distrustful of paper currency, it leads to inflation and actually makes the economy much, much worse. Another action they take is the civil constitution of the clergy. Functionally, this is a request that, a demand, if you will, that clergymen swear an oath of loyalty to the state. And you might say, why are they trying to do this? Well, remember, in monarchical absolutist France, the principle of divine right applied, and Catholicism was linked to the throne. And thus the revolutionaries saw the clergy as potentially a threat to revolutionary rule. And so they demanded that the clergy swear loyalty to the state. The problem was, clergymen saw this as a horrible abridgment of their religious conscience, that they are being asked to choose, if you will, between the land in which they live and their religious duties and their religious conscience. And so this tends to actually ratchet up tension and makes things far worse across France, which at this time was heavily Catholic. Another action the government takes is issuing this, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This is a seminal document in Western history. It established a new relationship between the people and the government. And it laid out, if you will, what the rights of the people that the government could not violate. I'll give you an example. Article 1 states as follows: all people shall have equal rights upon birth and ever after. General utility is the only permissible basis for social distinctions. And so what this is laying out is say goodbye to feudalism, say goodbye to noble privilege, say goodbye to churchly privilege, say goodbye to kingly privilege. All men are equal in this new French state. Now, in passing this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the National Assembly finishes its work. And so it decides to disband itself in 1791, which leads to the rise of the Legislative Assembly. Now, the Legislative Assembly becomes a much more radical governmental body for a reason that is noble but had bad ramifications. Namely, the National Assembly said that none of the people who worked in it could serve in the Legislative Assembly. They wanted to prevent people from thinking that they had undertaken this action to gain power for themselves. It's noble, it's a good idea. The problem is it meant that the Legislative Assembly was filled with, if you will, young gun revolutionaries, people who were more radical in their beliefs, such as a group known as the Jacobins, a group that believed strongly in a republic and wanted to do away with the king. Another sign of this radicalization was that they decided to declare war on what they saw as the enemies of the revolution. And that declaration of war is important because that declaration of war forms, if you will, the crucible into which the French state is poured, and that's going to be a period in which the French Revolution enters its most radical and violent stage. Part of the reason that the French Revolution becomes more radical is the arrival of this group here, the sans-culottes. The sans-culottes are the urban poor of Paris. They're the ones who already stormed the Bastille. And they're going to take a powerful position in pushing, if you will, the French Revolution in a more radical and more violent direction. As the urban poor, they want to achieve certain things. They want taxes on the wealthy, they want help with rent and food prices, and they want the government to act to fix their problems. A good example of the sans-culottes taking actions maybe against the government wishes is an event known as the September Massacres. To try and bring order to Paris during a time of war, martial law had been issued, and because of that, the prisons had started to be filled with people who had violated curfew, things like that. Upon hearing that the Prussians had captured Verdun, rumors spread that the people in the prisons must, of course, be Prussian agents. They're enemies of the state. They're going to rise up and open the city gates to the Prussians. And so the sans-culottes enter the prisons and over the course of several days execute everyone they find. A very violent turn. But another action that the sans-culottes take is political. They use the pressure that they have, the power that they have to push the Legislative Assembly to create a new government known as the National Convention. And the key part of this National Convention is it was going to be based on not voters who had property rights, as was the case under the Legislative Assembly, meaning that more middle-class professional people could vote but no one else. The National Convention was based on universal manhood suffrage, meaning that everyone could vote who was male, up to and including the urban poor. This means that this government is going to be much more radical. A further element of their political role is that the sans-culottes decide to ally with a more radical clique of the Jacobins known as the Mountain. And so what this means is you have the urban poor of Paris, this powerful discontent mob, allying with some of the most extreme members of the government. This is sort of the witch's brew that's coming together to create a very violent turn in the French Revolution. And some examples of this radicalization are the actions the National Convention takes. They expand the war. They are not simply content to fight off the Prussians. They declare war on what they see as the enemies of the revolution, Spain, Holland, and Great Britain. They also do away with the king, literally executing Louis XVI. To meet the needs of the war, though, they undertake actions as well. They issue a levée en masse, which is a massive call for the people to be a nation in arms and fight for the state. And to try and make the state run more efficiently, they set up the Committee of Public Safety. They set up this committee in an attempt to, in a time of crisis, run the government efficiently. And this Committee of Public Safety was led by this man here, Maximilien Robespierre. They used this small clique, this committee, to try and sustain the war and defend France against all enemies. And while this does work, they are able to succeed in pushing back the enemies of the revolution. It comes at a cost. Here you see a quote by Maximilien Robespierre. and in many ways it showcases the type of man he is. You should see in this, if you will, the influence of the general will of Rousseau on Robespierre and his political thinking. Consider some of the text of this. Virtue and terror being one and the same. Terror is nothing but prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. The problem is this attitude now has the levers of power and proceeds to use it. This is a time period of the Great Terror. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety use this time period to go to war against all enemies they see in society against the revolution. They turn against the nobles. They execute Louis XVI. They execute his wife, Marie Antoinette. They execute nobles, clergymen. But the problem is the terror doesn't just end there. The terror continues. In the end, numbers are hard to come by, but it's alleged that about 30,000 people die in this reign of terror. Some estimates go as high as 50,000. And they're executed here by guillotine at the Place de la Concorde in Paris. And in many ways, this becomes the symbol of the revolution run amok. The excess of violence, the excess of punishment of those deemed enemies of the revolution. The problem for Robespierre is the reign of terror will not continue. Upon hearing word that Robespierre has a new list of enemies that he's prepared to punish, and those in the government fearful that they might be on it, the people in the government move against Robespierre. Robespierre and his Committee of Public Safety are captured, are declared enemies themselves, and sent to the very guillotines that they had sent so many others. And thus Robespierre and his allies are executed. In its place, a directory is formed, a new government, one that's more conservative, one that is seemingly far less radical than Robespierre and his minions. But even then you should see a shift. Even then you should see a change, because even though they have pushed back against the radicalism of Robespierre, even though they have turned away from Robespierre and his attitude of terror and virtue, they're still waging war. And during the time of the Directory, they will not simply throw out the enemies of France, they conquer. They conquer the Austrian Netherlands. They conquer the Dutch Republic. After this period, the armies of the French Revolution would not simply defend the revolution, defend the French state, they're going to carry the revolution forward through conquest. And they're going to reach their height under the leadership of a man we'll cover in a lecture or two, Napoleon Bonaparte.